Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to Benjamin Franklin Hall on this lovely evening. I'm Peter Doherty. I'm editor-at-large of the recently relaunched American Philosophical Society Press, the longest operating scholarly publisher in North America, begun in 1771. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce one of the first authors of the newly relaunched press list, the historian of technology and essayist, Ed Tenner. In formulating the editorial strategy of the new APS Press, we returned to APS founder Benjamin Franklin's stated mission for the society of promoting useful knowledge and chose to build the new list around the goal of redefining useful knowledge for the 21st century. Following the stated goal, we set about signing books on the history, sociology, politics, philosophy, anthropology, and economics of useful knowledge, the vitally important institution in society that it increasingly is today. We want our list to be the focal point of a large and lively conversation about the production, curation, and communication of knowledge in society today. In Ed Tenner's book, Why the Hindenburg Had a Smoking Lounge, Essays in Unintended Consequences, we signed a book on precisely that, the history, sociology, politics, philosophy, anthropology, and economics of useful knowledge, as expressed in the way modern life works and sometimes doesn't work, from technology through organizations and politics. I first heard the name Ed Tenner back in the early 90s when I was in New York working for the Free Press. At the time, Ed was an editor at Princeton University Press, where he published a very distinguished list of science books, including works by authors such as Richard Feynman. Feynman's QED comes to mind. After Ed left the press in 1991, and before I moved to Princeton University Press in 1992, Ed started work on a book that would become the 1996 bestseller, Why Things Bite Back, Technology and the Revenge of Unintended Consequences. When I think of the so-called revenge effect of technology, the example that always comes to mind is boxing gloves, a technology introduced to protect boxers from head injuries, but that actually induced greater head injuries by extending boxers' careers. That's unanticipated consequences for you. Since then, Ed has written two related books, including The Efficiency Paradox, a book about what big data can't do, and Our Own Devices, on how technology has remade our bodies. Howard Siegel, reviewing Our Own Devices in the journal Nature, judged that, and I quote, Tenner has become a worthy successor to such luminaries as business philosopher Peter Drucker, social critic Lewis Mumford, and historian Lynn White in connecting technology's past, present, and future. All the while, Ed has been writing essays that have traced his exploration of unintended consequences well beyond technologies into other aspects of life, from organizations in politics through design, information, artificial intelligence, and the lives of animals. His new book, Why the Hindenburg Had a Smoking Lounge, which we are launching this evening, covers all of these fields, connecting the unintended dots between and among them, and offering ways to think about how ideas have consequences, often very different from those intended. In his remarks, Ed will be telling us about the intellectual history of unintended consequences and the thinkers, including prominent Philadelphian and APS member Robert K. Merton, who established the outlines of this line of social inquiry within the sociology of knowledge. Bob Merton was also my advisor in my first job as an editor, and so has a special status in this evening's talk. Ed Tenner holds a BA from Princeton and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He was a junior fellow of the Harvard Society of Fellows and a Guggenheim Fellow. He is a distinguished scholar of the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation and a visiting scholar in the Rutgers University History Department. In addition to his editorial work at Princeton University Press, where we did not overlap, Ed also has held visiting research positions in the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Institute for Advanced Study, the University of Pennsylvania, and in the Princeton Departments of and programs of Geosciences, English, and Information Technology Policy. For the second year in a row, he will be teaching a Princeton freshman seminar on understanding disasters as a lecturer in sociology. Since Bite Back appeared in 1996, he has been invited speaker at dozens of technology corporations, universities, and government agencies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Tenner.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that kind introduction. Thank all of you for coming here to this lecture. It is such a privilege to be here at this great, distinguished institution that I have long admired. I have worked in its library and seen its exhibitions, and it's really a special honor and pleasure. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who has made this possible: the Friends of the American Philosophical Society, the American Philosophical Society Press and its director, Kimberly Junta, Peter Doherty, of course, with whom this book would not have been written, his colleague, David Carpenter, who's also been indispensable, and special thanks to the design and production team of Kevin Connor and Dave Price. You see their work here. If you have any complaint with the contents that I have written, remember that you can't judge a cover by its book. So this talk will have 4 parts. The first is the potential Copernican revolution in social science that never happened and why it never happened. The second is the emergence of a study of unintended consequences from the 1970s to about 2005, led by outstanding thinkers, some of whom I had the honor of meeting. The third part is the shift from devices and structures to systems, from micro to macro unintended consequences, with the rise of social media and Web 2.0 around 2005 and the political upheavals that have followed. And I will conclude with the possibility of positive, paradoxical, unintended consequences, grounds for hope if we make friends with the chaos of the universe. This is the story of a revolution that never quite happened. In 1936, at the depths of the Depression, the result to a large extent of the Hawley-Smoot protective tariff of 1930, a 26-year-old newly credentialed Harvard sociology PhD and future American Philosophical Society member, Robert K. Merton, published a paper in the American Sociological Review, one of the papers most frequently cited in his discipline, quote, "The Unanticipated Consequences of Purposive Social Action." As he noted, this had been a theme of luminaries, including Machiavelli, Vico, Adam Smith, Marx, Engels, Wundt, Pareto, and Max Weber. He might have gone back to early Christian concepts of felix culpa, the happy guilt of original sin that made possible the advent of Christ and the salvation of humanity. While the language of the paper was modest, professional, and temperate, its insight that many or most phenomena in the social world are unintended for better as well as for worse was both obvious and revolutionary. Even 21st century management gurus like Tom Peters acknowledge it, quote, "Unintended consequences outnumber intended consequences. Strategies rarely unfold as we imagined. Intended consequences are rare," close quote. Merton promised, quote, "a monograph now in preparation to the history and analysis of this program with its vast scope and manifold implications, acknowledging that the present paper was elliptical at times." Somewhere along the way, he abandoned this project, perhaps because it risked becoming a book about everything. His dissertation on the sociology of science and technology in 17th century England became a classic in theories of the relationship between religion and social change and it proved much more successful as a case study in the tradition of Max Weber's still debated argument that so-called this worldly asceticism of Protestant entrepreneurs launched modern capitalism. Merton's still controversial findings linked the values of English Puritanism and German Protestant pietism with the rise of modern empirical scientific spirit, citing, for example, the Puritan majority of over 60% in the original membership of the Royal Society, on which the American Philosophical Society was patterned by Benjamin Franklin, who was a member of both. Merton's apparent retreat from his monograph project may have discouraged other social scientists from attempting it, revealing one of the paradoxes of the subject study. Because it is so universal and important, it is equally unwieldy and best suited for case studies rather than for grand theories. The Princeton University Library alone has no fewer than 105 books with titles that begin "The Irony of." Unintentionality-centered analysis might have produced a Copernican revolution in social science, but it is more likely that taken to its conclusion, it would have unleashed adverse unintended consequences on any scholar attempting it. Thomas Kuhn's ambiguous position on so-called paradigm shifts sold over 1 million books, but as I observed during his years at Princeton, it also brought the acrimony of professional peers, not to mention later publication of his former graduate student, the filmmaker Earl Morris's devastating memoir of The Ashtray. And The Ashtray, by the way, was one that Tom Kuhn, who was a chain smoker, threw allegedly at Morris when Morris was trying to argue for the objectivity of science. Despite ubiquity and academic fascination, there is still no center for the study of unintended consequences. A Google search reveals there apparently has never been such an organization, although its new artificial intelligence describes what one would study if it existed. This absence is surprising given the proliferation of funded research entities at American universities. The Princeton School of Public International Affairs, for example, lists 20 schools and programs. There are two reasons for this absence. The first is evident in our polarized world. Left and right agree on the prevalence of unintended consequences, but each blames the other side for adverse results. The second is apparent only to those who, like me, have helped establish a center. In my case, an ill-fated bicentennial publishing program 50 years ago. Let's say you are a scholar or scientist who does have an angel donor for such a project, providing handsome salaries and comfortable accommodations. The bicentennial nonprofit I helped set up in the mid-70s could afford a suite in an elegant 1920s neo-Gothic skyscraper overlooking Chicago's lakefront. If you are starting the centers to support your work, even with an able administrator, you are likely to be spending your time raising funds for fellowships and events, filing university and government reports, and doing everything but the unintended consequences research you set up the center to pursue. In other words, living an unintended consequence. I never reached this stage. Our financial support, remaining a secret of our founder, vanished before we could publish a single book. The organization's failure nevertheless led, unintentionally, to my publishing and writing careers. There are also ideological barriers to the study of unintended consequence. For every enthusiast, there seems to be a hater, and dwelling on the unintended consequences of an opponent's policies invites retaliation in kind. This was the point of the most sophisticated critique of the theme by the economist and American Philosophical Society member Albert O. Hirschman. Hirschman, paradoxically, had formidable credentials as a student of unintended consequences. One of his most celebrated and controversial ideas, the hiding hand, was a takeoff on Adam Smith's metaphor for the market. In development projects observed in 1967, Hirschman noted that many successful programs might never have been launched had all the difficulties been known, but once a commitment had been made, human ingenuity prevailed and new and unforeseen means were found. This, of course, is the reverse of the idea of the planning fallacy, that promoters of projects systematically underestimate the time and resources needed. Perhaps the most famous example cited by theorists on both sides is the Sydney Opera House. Having exceeded its budget by 1,300%, it nevertheless remains a masterpiece, Australia's unofficial icon, and thus a bargain. At the Institute in 1992, when I was visiting, Hirschman gave me a preview of his argument to temper any project on technological failure. It was published in 1996. It was published in 1992 as The Rhetoric of Reaction, Perversity, Futility, and Jeopardy. During the previous year, when I was visiting in the School of Social Science, I found that provoked by the rise of neoconservatism, Hirschman took aim at the characteristic position of the old and new right that reforms urged by progressives would be self-defeating or useless. But he did not spare fellow liberals' use of similar attacks on conservative proposals. In the early 1990s, the internet was still a niche service until the arrival of the World Wide Web and modern browsers in 1995, and its political implications unforeseeable. It was assumed that digital life would be another channel for established commercial, media, and political organizations. Unintended Consequences of the 1990s were still fixated on two themes that had emerged in the 19th century. One was the apparently treacherous behavior of everyday devices, reflected in the famous Twilight Zone episode, A Thing About Machines, in which the snooty, arrogant critic Bartlett Finchley is finally assassinated by his fed-up domestic appliances. Fans of Hilaire Belloc, the great humorist, will recall his verse, which I quoted in Bite Back, quote, "Lord Finchley tried to mend the electric light himself. It struck him dead and served him right. It is the business of the wealthy man to give employment to the artisan." Its inverse was the frequency of apparently stupid mistakes by the users of technology, represented by failed experiments in the early Cold War space program. The Air Force engineer Ed Murphy was blaming the operators rather than the machines, and what he really meant was less, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong, than another folk saying, you can't make it foolproof because fools are too ingenious. This sentiment has been contested by safety engineers who have developed techniques for mistake proofing, applied with great success in Japan, where they are known as poka-yokes. Three giants dominated the unintended consequences studies of the 1990s: the Yale sociologist Charles Perrow, the Duke engineering professor Henry Petrosky, an APS member, and the cognitive psychologist Donald Norman, originally of the University of California at San Diego. Perrow's work on technological disasters was inspired by the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1979, notable not for loss of life or property, but for the discovery of the world's vulnerability to operator errors in critical systems. The event inspired radical redesign of nuclear system controls and a reaction against the technology that lasted until the consequences of fossil fuels and the demands of artificial intelligence inspired a 20th century revival, an unintended consequence of decisions aimed at preventing unintended consequences. In a paper published in 1981, Perrow introduced influential concepts of loose coupling and tight coupling in technological systems to analyze risk. Instead of blaming operators, Murphy style, Perrow focused on what he called error-inducing systems. Considering nuclear plants, he questioned safety engineers' goal of preventing all mistakes. Even with the most careful design, some technological systems remain vulnerable to cascades of failure and inevitable deviation. A good example is mode error. When the Stockholm collided with the pride of the Italian fleet, the Andrea Doria, in 1956, resulting in a total loss, investigators believed the major cause was the mistaken reading of a radar screen that showed a single display in two settings, near and far. The navigator of the Stockholm read the wrong one and believed the ship was several times farther from the Italian liner than it really was. X-ray machines with similar choices of scales have led to tragic deaths when technicians have been unaware that they were selecting high-intensity beams. Preventing these mode errors has become an essential part of interface design. Perrow was skeptical of such remedies in tightly coupled systems like nuclear plants. He argued that nuclear power was systematically too risky, a position apparently vindicated by the meltdown of the Chernobyl reactor in the Soviet Union 2 years later, which contaminated 150,000 square kilometers, required the evacuation of 200,000 people, and led to an epidemic of excess thyroid cancer in children. Henry Petrosky's career as unintended consequences analyst was also shaped by 3 Mile Island. Petrosky was an expert in engineering physics doing important work on fracture analysis at Argonne National Laboratory, a center for nuclear plant research. Anticipating nuclear research funding cuts, Petrosky returned to academia with a new focus on interpreting engineering thinking for lay audiences and especially on engineering failures. For Petrosky, failure was both deplorable and inevitable in engineering as designers developed new paradigms after the failure of previous models. As they grew more confident, they increased the scale of their work until it reached a tipping point in such disasters as the wreck of the Titanic in 1912 and the destruction of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, galloping Gertie from unanticipated harmonic vibrations under wind load in 1940. The designers of both the ocean liner and the bridge, Thomas Andrews and Leon Moseyev, respectively, were at the top of their professions, as was Titanic's master, Captain Edward Smith. As new generations of engineers expand innovative paradigms, they forget the lessons of past generations and may in turn overreach. Rejecting Perrow's rejection of entire categories, Petrosky saw catastrophes as necessary tragedies in the improvement of safety. As he later wrote in the Washington Post on the 100th anniversary of Titanic's sinking, quote, "Had the Titanic not sunk, competing steamship lines may have wanted to one-up White Star by building still larger ships with fewer lifeboats and bulkheads which restrict passenger movement, resulting in even more dangerous vessels. The sinking provided a wake-up call that fundamentally changed maritime regulation, including the establishment of an international ice patrol. Stronger ships outfitted with enough lifeboats to accommodate passengers and crew became the norm. Overall, safety was improved by tragedy," close quote. Petrosky might have added that new safety measures, if not carefully applied, could result in new tragedies, as when the excursion ship Eastland capsized in Chicago River in 1915 while young factory workers were boarding for a company trip. The lifeboats and deck stiffening added after Titanic made the Eastland fatally unstable, as the economist George W. Hinton showed in a book in 1995. Norman's specialty was and is human-centered design, the prevention of errors and injuries through an understanding of human behavior as well as technology. Enthusiasts of alternatives like the Dvorak simplified keyboard attacked customary QWERTY key arrangement carried over from typewriters to word processors as an inefficient legacy of the need to slow typing speed in early 20th century models. Norman and his collaborator David Rummelhart debunked the supposed advances of the Dvorak layout, showing that it increased typing speed only marginally over QWERTY, implying that retraining people and refitting keys would not be worth the time and expense. The 1990s were also the heyday of the critical technology insiders, computer scientists and other professionals who often questioned the cornucopian futurism of Silicon Valley's founders and marketers, and social scientists fascinated by technological change. Rob Kling, who died much too young in 2003, was a computer scientist who retrained as a sociologist and wrote one of the most important papers of the 1990s, helping frame computer adoption not as self-evident functionality, but as a social movement. Peter G. Neumann, a pioneer of the predecessor of Unix operating system at Bell Labs, still maintains a database of computer risks that is a goldmine for all students of unintended consequences. In hindsight, for all the anomalies and paradoxes discovered by these scientists and humanists, the technological world of the 1990s was not so much a revolution of existing organizations and authorities as its digital extension. Newspapers published electronic editions to widen access to their information, often without paywalls, supported by new categories of banner advertising. Scientific and medical authorities used the web to distribute the latest research findings to the lay citizenry. Libraries and museums made scans of documents and works of art available remotely. Best of all, virtual objects seemed not to replace but to promote in-person visits. Even after the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, the 15 years from 1990 to 2005 were the golden age of information technology. In 2005 marked the peak year of newspaper profits after 10 years of the web. The best-selling book by Microsoft's young CEO Bill Gates and his collaborators, The Road Ahead, published in 1996, promised a consumer paradise of, quote, friction-free commerce, close quote. Until 2005 or so, the world had a plan then. Thanks to Moore's law, the theory that computer processing power would continue to double forever, every 18 months, so that an electric shaver, it was said, already had more than the hardware and software of the Apollo program, paradise was assured. We had a plan, a road ahead in the 1990s. After the dust of the dot-com bubble in 2000, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, and the Great Recession of 2008, there seemed to be a new dawn at the end of the first century's decade, a sense that social media would at last fulfill the countercultural and progressive goals of replacing hierarchies with cooperative structures. But as Mike Tyson put it, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the nose. Beginning around 2005, the world of journalistic, academic, medical, and political authority has been punched in the nose by a new generation of entrepreneurs creating unforeseen empires. The unintended consequences of the late 20th and early 21st centuries were micro. The new unintended consequences, positive and negative, were macro. First came Google. In February 2002, I participated in a so-called scenario planning workshop sponsored by the Library of Congress on the future of born digital information, web pages with no physical counterpart. The superiority of Google's algorithm for discovering information was the talk of the meeting, but none of us imagined how it could ever sustain itself. Plans to sell the company had fallen through. In a brainstorming session, one of us raised the possibility that the US government might have to buy and operate Google as a public resource. 3 years later came the spectacular public offering that still grew a non-committal story from Technology Review. God, but for how long? Facebook, founded 2 years after our conference in 2004, offered its own IPO in 2012, raising $16 billion. The next year, Twitter raised $1.8 billion. Google's founders had created an algorithm that seemingly directed information seekers to the most relevant sources based on the results of previous searches. Unlike the originally curated Yahoo, it left selection to algorithms, and this reflected popularity rather than authority. As a Google researcher explained in a lecture at Princeton I attended, a searcher in the United States, where acupuncture is still a marginal movement, would see results different from those in Asian countries where it is mainstream therapy. A question framed in a way that suggested Jewish identity would produce one list of links, one that implied anti-Semitism would generate another. It was a first step toward realizing the epistemological anarchism that had flourished in some quarters of academia in the 1980s and 1990s. Facebook and Twitter took crowdsourcing even further, promising a new freedom to propagate and transmit opinions without gatekeepers and without charge, an extension of Bill Gates' promised freedom from friction. These and others like YouTube, which is now owned by Google and which is preserving this lecture, helped create the kind of virtual communities preached by web visionaries in the 1980s and 1990s. The New York University Media Studies professor, Clay Shirky, a self-described advocate of the free culture movement, excuse me, proclaimed the dawn of the social media age exuberantly in his 2008 book, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. Web 2.0, as it was called, punched authorities in the nose. Print and even most online publication was an inefficient way to reach customers. Only a handful of readers of business publications, for example, have both the means and the inclination to buy the luxury vacation homes and automobiles traditionally advertised there. Social media companies accumulate and deploy information on users' backgrounds and browsing habits to target only the small numbers of potential serious buyers. The diversion of advertising accelerated the already severe concentration of U.S. news media that in previous pandemics had tended to favor the messages of public health and medical authorities. And there was another punch to come: decline of the credibility of those authorities in the eyes of many U.S. citizens and the rise of influencers from pop culture and politics. One study of social media in the early phase of the COVID-19 pandemic by Sylvia Jaworska of the University of Reading and her colleagues revealed that the most frequently retweeted posts on Twitter, now X, were made by political figures such as Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, as well as President Donald Trump and pop culture celebrities. Medical and health authorities use social media too, but the greatest impact measured by the retweets of COVID-related posts was that of the British pop star Harry Styles, with 97,000 retweets per COVID tweet. Authorities and social media platforms faced an intractable dilemma. Because small numbers of dissenters were so zealous, their impact was disproportionate, yet moderating allegedly false information also helped spread it through charges of censorship. Among credentialed experts, social media have also elevated a group I call the alt-authorities, men and women with strong credentials who had been dissenters in their fields before the rise of social media, but have now been able to appeal directly to the public, and some of them now hold high positions in the Trump administration. The formerly Democratic protectionist economist Peter Navarro, the dissenting physicians Ahmed Oz and Jay Bhattacharya, and especially the former environmental lawyer and campaigner Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. The proliferation of peer-reviewed scientific papers, some more carefully reviewed than others, means that there is often some evidence for any point of view. The authorities have shattered the norm of politically neutral consensus science. Creators promised freedom from arrogant gatekeepers have also been punched in the nose. In 2019, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, a study by the U.S. Writers Association Authors Guild revealed that in the 8 years since 2009, itself a recession year, the income of writers had declined by 42% due to the impact of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. The 1990s dream of authors bypassing publishers and agents to issue their own work faced Amazon's domination of self-publishing market. Amazon's control of the digital and book trade also encouraged purchase of used copies and accelerated the consolidation of publishers, reducing competition for new book contracts. Fortunately for me, it was still vigorous when my book, Why Things Bite Back, was auctioned in the early 1990s. Artificial intelligence has given creators, writers, visual artists, and composers another punch. The major sites are trained on countless unlicensed text and images. There are already dozens of copyright lawsuits, but Silicon Valley corporations have a combined market valuation 10 to 100 times that of all the world's publishing and media companies combined, and the plaintiffs also face a juggernaut of lobbying power, promoting legislation, declaring training so-called fair use, letting the services compete against creators with their own words and images, as artists painfully note. Worst of all, the large language models are being trained increasingly on their own previous output, threatening a downward spiral of quality. Over multiple generations, this trend threatens to lead to what artificial intelligence researchers call model collapse, or put more bluntly, slop. Early in the introduction of large language models, elite professionals believed that while artificial intelligence could replace journeyman work, it could help them perform even better. Recent research challenges this assumption. A study published last fall in Organization Science concludes that, quote, "We do not find evidence that high-quality service measured by their past performance and employment moderates the adverse effect on employment. In fact, we find suggestive evidence that top freelancers are disproportionately affected by AI. While businesses still seem to prefer elite workers, a few are beginning to shift to AI-enhanced journeymen, especially because evidence suggests that the elite may not be enjoying the expected multiplier effect of new technology and may be less productive because of it, something that instructors among you should remind their students of. Is influencing a substitute for creators declining conventional prospects? In fact, social media sites are a doubtful alternative for the great majority who launch them. In 2024, the Wall Street Journal reported that nearly half of all influencers made $15,000 or less. The apparent good news that 12% could earn $100,000 or more was less encouraging than it seemed. Platforms were reducing payouts and pressure and pressuring to produce compelling material was grueling. One TikToker received a mere $120 for a video viewed 10 million times, and TikTok's future in the United States, of course, is still uncertain. On the other side, there are internet service provider fees, electronics and lighting costs, insurance, managers' fees, and complex tax situations for those who receive free products. Finally, and sadly, some police officers defending the Capitol and Congress did literally get punched during the January 2021 insurrection. Donald Trump, as his attorneys later stressed, had told his supporters to go, quote, peacefully and patriotically. Whatever his intentions and expectations, the riot was directed not from above, but organized from below in a cruel parody of progressive dreams of mass empowerment through social media. During the past 2 decades, it appeared that the dream of self-organized protest through mobile networks and social media, dubbed smart mobs by the progressive technological visionary Howard Rheingold, would topple one authoritarian regime after another. The year 2020 brought the first blow. The Chinese government's suppression of previously vigorous free speech in Hong Kong showed that technologically advanced states would squelch electronic dissent. But the assault on the Capitol was a bottom-up grassroots movement, believing against all evidence that the 2020 election had been stolen and attacking a democratically elected legislature in the name of democracy. According to a 2023 staff memo of the House committee investigating the events, quote, alt-tech, fringe, and mainstream platforms were exploited in tandem by right-wing activists to bring American democracy to the brink of ruin. These platforms enabled the mobilization of extremists on smaller sites and whipped up conservative grievance on larger, more mainstream ones, close quote. Even the still Democratic House majority, though, was already unwilling to call out Silicon Valley, according to a Washington Post analysis. Clay Shirky proved all too correct when he wrote in 2008, quote, the power to coordinate otherwise dispersed groups will continue to improve. New social tools are being invented. The freedom to act as a group is inherently political. But he left out the inverse, that usability implies abusability, something that I have called deviant ingenuity. I can't help wondering what Robert K. Merton would have made of the world of 2025 with more unintended consequences than he and his generation had ever imagined. He was wise not to become a prophet. Silicon Valley now seems to bite back the very institutions that created it, the Ivy League, Berkeley, Stanford, and the National Science Foundation, not to mention the progressive newspapers and magazines that extolled utopian cyberculture. Nor does there seem to be any feasible means to counterpunch. Yet I find paradoxical grounds for hope in the interpretation that what left and right see are powerful trends are instead the cumulative results of a chaotic sequence of chance events. These may soon lead to catastrophes, but there is an equal chance of unexpected positive outcomes. My original specialty was Central European history. Vienna, between the 2 world wars, was a defeated capital of a dissolved empire torn between the violence of communists, fascists, and ultimately Nazis, and, quote, bombed about a bit, close quote, in the Second World War, as the narrator of The Third Man put it in the film's introduction. The Soviet occupation did not end until 1955. Yet today, Vienna is the world's most livable city for the 3rd year in a row, according to an Economist Intelligence Unit survey, which reminds me of the saying of the Viennese journalist Alfred Polgar, misinterpreted to his contemporary Karl Kraus, quote, the situation is hopeless, but not serious, close quote. Thank you. And I will welcome questions.
Please wait for the mic. Here we go. Right over here.
Thank you. Since you have studied and commented on Web 2.0, do you have any thoughts on what the potential unintended consequences of Web 3.0 and cryptocurrency will be?
Cryptocurrencies are one of the very few things of the 21st century that, to my knowledge, no science fiction author of the 20th century imagined. And I can't begin to enumerate all of the potential threats from cryptocurrencies, but on the other hand, I would also say that wherever there is chaos, there is also the possibility of something unexpectedly good happening. I can't imagine that yet, but give me time. Yes, sir.
Thank you. But could you talk a little bit about the smoking lounge on the Hindenburg?
Oh, yeah. I was hoping, I left it out hoping that someone in the audience would ask about it. And that was one of the most interesting investigations that I had. So part of the study of unintended consequences is taking something that people thought was really, obvious. They didn't give any second thought to, like there was a smoking lounge on the Hindenburg. Well, isn't there something strange about that? I thought so. Fortunately, there is a scholar who wrote an excellent book on the Hindenburg, working for the first time in a study of this kind with the original archives of the Zeppelin Company, and I corresponded with him about it, and I asked him. Of course, the designs of it were there, but there were no records of any discussion of it, no records of discussion of the risk or anything like that. And he said, "Well, the papers haven't been sorted yet, so who knows what's there." So I can't give an answer from the point of view of designers. However, there is an economic answer, and I wrote that essay for the American Enterprise Institute. I've been one of the few people published both by the AEI Online and by Mother Jones. But the economic logic was really very clear. A passage on the Hindenburg cost twice the fare of the world's most luxurious liner in first class, the Normandy, the Ship of Light, which is the greatest ocean liner of all time. So it was really like the Concorde in relation to first class on a 747 at the time, which meant that there was a small number of potential customers who were willing to have the more Spartan accommodations for the great view and the greater speed. And half of them were smokers. So there really was no choice but to accommodate the smokers somehow. The smoking lounge was as carefully engineered as you can imagine. It had a negative air pressure so that any fire in there would not spread, and there were also no open lights. The cigarettes, and believe it or not, cigars too, could be lit by something like the coils that used to come in automobile lighters. But there was a little problem there, because the person who was supposed to be keeping watch over the passengers so that nobody absent-mindedly after a few drinks exited with a lit smoke was also supposed to be mixing drinks for the passengers. So there was a human factor issue there. There were, but it was so well known though that there were publicity commemorative ashtrays that were sponsored by the company, made by a company still existing in Pennsylvania, and one of the features of them was a glass dirigible in the form of the Zeppelin filled with genuine aviation fuel by Esso. I'm not kidding. When you're in unintended consequences, you don't have to make anything up. So in the end, it was not the smoking lounge that did it in the Hindenburg, of course. But the other reason for the tragedy of the Hindenburg was that the Zeppelin Company had an amazing record of safety through storms, through lightning, through all kinds of terrible conditions. They were the best. It was like a perfect record, whereas the American and British dirigibles had many, many problems, and well-publicized disasters of their own. So Zeppelin seemed to be a really safe choice until it wasn't. But think of something else, though. You think of the smoking that was permitted on world airplanes until the 1980s. There was oxygen above. There were oxygen masks. Here are people smoking away. So I didn't think about that at the time. You know, who thought about that at the time? So there are lots of absurd things in life that when you look back, you say, how could people have done this? But we're all that way. That's humanity.
We got one right here.
Yeah. It seems we're in a period where we have access to more information than any time in history. Yet it seems an unintended consequence of that is more people retreat to certainty about things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, I'd be interested in your comments.
I'm not sure. It's hard to say one way or the other to study it. Maybe there are studies that show it, but I think that like looking back, I think, for example, at the wars of religion in France, incredible bloodshed. But I think that people on the Protestant side and people on the Catholic side were really very certain of their positions, and they were not about to read the tracts of the the Calvinists or read the Catholic devotional literature to get a better understanding. So I think today we're probably exaggerating how uniquely polarized people are today. But that's just an impression. There may be evidence for what you've just said. I just haven't found it.
That was a great, entertaining talk. Thank you, and thank you for publishing with the press. I have a question that might sound like it's coming from left field. I'm a historian by training, and one of the things historians will often do when they're sitting around is, talk about counterfactuals, but also often say, well, you can't really study counterfactuals, and you've just shown you can have a field of study in unintended consequences. So I was wondering if I could ask you, if you were to create a center that doesn't exist on counterfactual history, what would that? Is there a utility in studying counterfactuals, and how would you do it?
I'm so glad you asked that question because it's a very sad story for me and my family. My brother, who was very active in that movement, died 2 years ago, and it was a shock for the people in the movement. It was obviously devastating for us. It was a younger brother, and I've been thinking of writing something about that as a memorial to him. Let me say, but there has been some interest in the theory of alternative history recently. Marxists, of course, are absolutely dead set against it, but there are other historians who are more open to it. And if you're interested, I can give you some good references on that because, as I said, I'm about to write about it. But the thing that to me is the complication of alternative history is that when you do alternative history, you assume that there's one switch, and you throw the switch, like Alexander the Great gets killed in this battle or that battle, as he nearly did, or Peter the Great gets killed. I mean, there were lots of things like that where really consequential people nearly died. But then what you find is not just a single rail going out from the switch, but then you find a whole switchyard. You find a chaotic world of all kinds of other weird things that could happen. And so that isn't to disparage alternative history, but the challenge is to explore that in a really sophisticated way. One example that I remember very clearly is, what if there had been no Islam? What if the movement had failed? What would have happened in the Near East? And the author of that book said that the same conflicts between Muslims and Christians and between different sects of Islam would have happened among the Eastern churches. In other words, that there was a structure of conflict, and Islam sort of factored into it. But without Islam, it isn't that everybody would be living in harmony. They'd be fighting over different religious ideas.
I'm intrigued by your point that some technology that is safe or that has been perfected, when the scale increases, then it's liable to fail. And that sounds like a recipe for being aware of that. I wonder if you could give us some examples, and if there's anything now that you see that is on the brink of that kind of disaster based on the fact that it's gotten to a scale or to a complexity that is beyond what it had originally been.
Well, I think probably, the last question about cryptocurrencies, I think cryptocurrencies probably create more risk than any other innovation that I can think of, partly because cryptocurrencies are really a form of gambling. And instead, the present administration seems to be treating them, as the advocates say, as the future of finance. And so it's really for example, the presence of cryptocurrencies in the portfolios of major institutions, of banks, maybe of government funds. And so what started out as a speculative mania could become enmeshed in much more broadly in society. I'll give you an example from Philadelphia of a craze that kind of fizzled out in itself. In the mid 1830s, there was a movement to cultivate a certain kind of mulberry bush on which you could grow silkworms. And the idea was that you could get rich cultivating silkworms at home, and there would be a great American silk industry instead of having to import silk from Europe or Asia. And you find often Mulberry Street, or cities like Mulberry Street in cities like Dr. Seuss, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. And many of those streets date from the time when people were planting mulberry bushes or trees as part of that. In fact, I was able, in a library in Philadelphia, I was able to read a book about that when I investigated it for Why Things Bite Back. So, but that was something that burned out, and the reason it burned out was that cultivating silkworms requires a certain kind of highly trained people, generally women, who had been taught by their mothers, and it's a very, very difficult thing. And America never really had the people to teach that skill, or enough people who were devoted enough to spend their time. However, there was another indirect result of that I discussed in Bite Back, and that is that there was a noted astronomer named Leopold Trouvelot who moved to Boston. He published one of the outstanding atlases, astronomical atlases of all time. But he thought that the solution for America to develop its own silk industry was an insect from Europe called the gypsy moth. And he started to raise gypsy moths in the suburbs of Boston. And the thing about gypsy moths is that because of their habits, it's very easy for gypsy moths to land on the wagons that were transporting agricultural goods throughout New England. And so the growth of commerce spread gypsy moths, throughout the East Coast at least. So to me, that's a good example of how one craze can fizzle, but it can also lead to another craze that has many, many more serious consequences.
Time for one more. Okay. There's one up here.
Yes, thank you. You've talked about like data and information. It looks like we're going through another revolution right now, like biological, where companies are doing genetic engineering. Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought to what your comments might be if you were giving this lecture 50 years from now about like making like little mice look like woolly mammoths?
Yeah. Well, another thing that those same companies are working on is longevity technology. So You know, if they're successful, maybe I will. But meanwhile, I should say that the real frontier on the genetic side seems to be the use of not simply changing the germline genes, but like hooking people up to larger systems with nanotechnology, nano robots that go into the bloodstream. So things have really changed since the 90s, when cloning and like germline genetic enhancement, I mean, they're still there, but they're less prominent. There's a book by that I have a review in press, Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Nearer. And if you want to see the latest thinking in that, with abundantly documented, it's his second book on the subject. But if you want to see the latest thinking, it was published last year. If you want to see the latest thinking on that, that's a really great place to start, because Kurzweil is unlike some of the other Silicon Valley people, he's really a major inventor who has helped mankind, and who's also trying to live forever himself. So that's another side of the book. But I suggest that, and if you are curious about more, it's going to appear in the summer issue. My review essay will appear in the summer issue of the Milken Institute Review. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Ed, thanks very much. Beautiful talk. To me, the greatest unintended consequence is that Mike Tyson finally gets recognition as an outstanding American philosopher.
Deservedly so. Deservedly so. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks, Ed.